Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome back to this next part of the Sync Digital Wellness Summit. And thank you so much for joining us once again. And also, of course, a huge shout out to our online audience that are joining us from all over the world today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, some food for thought. Just as nutrition labels help protect us against bad ingredients or dangerous ingredients, should digital technologies also come with the same warning signs? Well, it's time now to find out through our next panel, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Matthew P. Bergman, founding attorney of the Social Media Victims Law Center and professor at Lewis and Clark Law School from the United States. A very warm welcome. Our next guest is Johannes Thrul. He is the PhD assistant professor at the Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, United States, at the end there. And sitting in the middle is Bruce Daisley. He is the author and former vice president of Twitter. There we go. Our esteemed panel, thank you so much for joining us. And I know that two of you have come in from the US, you've come in from the UK, so thank you very much for joining us here today. Now, I wanted to start off with Johannes, if possible. I wanted to start off with the mental health perspective. What exactly is the biggest concern now when it comes to the internet and the use of digital technologies in your mind?
Yeah, so the thing I'm most concerned with right now is that algorithms of tech companies, social media companies in particular, are optimized to sustain user attention and monetize user attention, and they're not optimized for user wellness and happiness and digital well-being. And that is a concern I have that is leading to overuse, depression, and anxiety. And that is a choice that can be changed. And I think we should hold companies accountable to do that. On the other hand, and I come from a digital and mobile health space, I'm a psychologist by training. I also develop interventions, and I see technology as an incredible tool to foster wellness and to make people's lives better and healthier and happier. And so I think we can all work together to move the needle in the right direction when it comes to technology use and health.
Do you think this mentality is very much like the same as many other addictions out there then? Is it the same mentality?
So in my mind, I think we have to attack this problem on three different levels, right? On the one hand, I think we have heard in a lot of sessions so far that there is responsibility on us as the end user, and I certainly agree with that. But I think the conversation shouldn't stop there, right? So I want to encourage everyone to tinker with their own technology use. I have certainly done the same for over 10 years now. So trying to adopt a growth mindset and working on your own technology use, like leaving your phone at home and see how that goes and see how you react, and that you're actually not missing out on things most of the time, and sort of dealing with that anxiety. It's like exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so in that way, assuming a growth mindset and playing around with making different behavior changes and see how you feel. And then a lot of times you will likely feel better for it. The second part of it is changing social norms, and we have heard about this today as well. So the approach there would be to have conversations with friends and family around what is okay with technology use and what isn't. And when I'm having a conversation with someone, that person in front of me is the most important person in the world in that moment, and I want to give them my full attention. And I think we owe that to each other, and we deserve that attention, to give that attention to each other. And that is going to change social norms, and that is going to change culture. And the third aspect, and this is what I already alluded to, is holding companies accountable. Warning labels can be one approach, but I think changing algorithms to prioritize user health and happiness is one way to do this. And algorithms are by no means artificial intelligence that just does, optimizes out of thin air. We set the parameters that algorithms are optimized for. And we have the choice to change that.
Thank you so much. Some great advice there. Bruce, over to you. Now, you ran Twitter's business in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Tell us a little bit more about some of the trends that you've noticed in the different parts of the world when it comes to the use of digital technologies. Does it differ around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things prior to working at Twitter, I worked at YouTube really very much from the moment that Google bought it. I spent 4 years working there, and we spotted big trends, far more at Twitter than at YouTube. But yeah, often social products unevenly distributed. So you'll see, especially with Snapchat and Twitter, they don't necessarily have identical usage patterns. In fact, in the kingdom, there's huge usage of Twitter. If you were to travel to Egypt or other areas in the region, the usage is significantly lower. So we sort of witness big differences in the patterns. I think, the one thing I'd add to what Johannes said is that there's often unintended consequences of actions that are taken. I worked at Google when Google introduced Google+. And the intention of Google+, you remember Google+, right? Google+ was Google's Facebook killer, I'll remind you. And the thing that we learned there very quickly, so the concept of Google+, for anyone who blinked and missed it, was that you didn't necessarily have one uniform collection of friends. You had lots of subsets. And so consequently, you could arrange all of your friends into circles. Lovely idea. What was learned very quickly is people hate any administration when it comes to social platforms. Another example of that, at Twitter, we found that the onboarding of Twitter, generally you could make it nuanced, sophisticated. You could ask people, because you knew if users had a timeline full of content, they were more likely to come back. Users generally skipped the onboarding. Half of all of Twitter's new users never came back the following day and never came back again. So that onboarding process, as nuanced as you might make it, often is regarded as a frustration and annoyance to users. So often what you find when it comes to digital products is there's a conceived way that you might want to create it, construct the architecture, and then there's the actual way that users end up putting that into place. And so, witness the complexities of this next time you skip that YouTube ad that for the last 4 years has been offering you 1 month subscription for free. And pretty much everyone regards that as how you get into YouTube now. You skip that YouTube ad and you go in. But that architecture doesn't necessarily ever work in exactly the way that the product's intended.
Matthew, it's over to you now very quickly. What is the mission? I mean, you set up the Social Media Victims Law Center over in the US. What sort of inspired you to do that? What was that off the back of?
Well, I was inspired by both the absolute mental health crisis among teenagers and as I learned about the social media utilization of these algorithms, I realized that this is no different than the asbestos companies or the tobacco companies that I've been suing for 40 years. And what you have is that the consequences of a for-profit decision to maximize adolescent screen time is the benefits are accrued by the companies, but the costs are social costs. And those costs consist of parents that I've talked to who have to bury their children instead of having their children bury them. There are girls who will never get to be mothers because their bodies have been ravaged by anorexia nervosa. There are children who can never succeed because they've had severe depression during their high school years and can't get into college. Or children or people whose capacity for intimacy has been forever destroyed by sexual abuse over the internet. And then there are the providers, the doctors who have to bear the cost, the psychologists. And then, of course, the clergy. You think about the rabbis, you think about the imams, you think about the priests and the ministers who have to cater and comfort families who've undergone this horrific loss. And the concept of product liability is a legal doctrine that developed in the 1940s on and said that strict liability, responsibility, should rest in the hands of the individual that is most capable of making the product safe. And in this case, that's the social media companies. And the only way that they are going to make a safer product is if it is in their economic incentive to do so. Until they have to pay the claims of the individuals that have been ravaged by their greed and avarice, they're not going to change. There might be regulation which will help on the margins. They might make some face-saving changes, but until the costs of paying victims exceeds the benefits of designing these dangerous products, we will not see the change that we as a world and we as parents need.
It's so interesting because you know, a lot of the theme over the past couple of days, you know, you do have to take accountability yourself. But obviously, when we're talking about the youth, it's a different ball game, essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean, children's brains aren't fully developed. They're twice as susceptible to addiction. They don't have the judgment. Their brains or their frontal cortex isn't developed, and yet these companies are profiting from them. Instagram called it an existential threat to the company if they were to lose some business. So that's why all legal systems have to hold these companies accountable, as Johannes said.
Well, I love your passion for it, I really do. And back over to Johannes. So what's the solution? Do we need these warning signs just as food packages have them? What's the solution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a scientist, I would always go with evidence. And obviously, you know, the internet is not the same, right? Like a social media platform is not the same as Wikipedia. And so I think we, you know, as a scientist, I always like to say we need more research on that because I do think going evidence-based is incredibly important, especially in a situation where there is a lot of misinformation out there and the trust and the brands we have, right, that we are trustworthy from a public health side of things is incredibly important moving forward. And so I think I come from substance use research, addiction research. I have done a lot of research on tobacco and the tobacco industry. And so when I think about what has worked in tobacco, one of the most effective tobacco control strategies, public campaigns, has been the Truth Campaign in the United States. And the Truth Campaign targeted young adult smokers. And the message that that campaign was sending is the tobacco industry is manipulating you as replacement smokers to recruit you as a new smoker. And that campaign was incredibly effective. It has been tested. It has been shown to be incredibly effective. The message resonates with young people. And so when I think along the same lines of, you know, the message of the social dilemma, for example, the message that we heard about today already is you are the product. You and your data are the product on these platforms. And it makes me wonder how effective that message would be as a warning label on a social media platform and how much that would resonate, especially with young users.
But don't we know that already? We know that because the penetration of the social dilemma content, that video, has been watched by, I would say, at least half the cohort of the people who use Instagram, and it hasn't influenced their behavior at all.
Yeah.
I think to some extent, in the same way that we skip through the terms and conditions of the internet as a cost of doing business, to some extent, for me, this is probably a distraction that tech firms would be comfortable with. I personally, from being on the inside, the challenge that we felt was that often there's an argument for how you police the whole usage of these sites. And effectively, you'll find, if you've ever tried to report something, you'll find that often the procedure is very difficult, you don't get much response. And that's largely because the amount of resource that goes into responding to users on Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, the amount of resource that goes into it is incredibly low. And I always thought one of the most helpful things would be is if it was legally their responsibility to share transparency of data. How many incoming user requests do they get a year? How long does it take them to reply? How many people do they have in the kingdom? How many people do they have outside the kingdom responding to those requests? Because as soon as that transparency of data comes around, then we can start having a discussion. As someone who worked in a series of these companies, I know that at times we had a really small number of people working for half the planet at the time. They might be working out of Budapest, they might be working out of the Philippines. If anyone knew, if any politician knew in the United States, in Australia, in Britain, in the kingdom, if any politician knew how few people were responding to those requests, it would immediately become a political discussion. And so, to my mind, I think some degree of transparency would be helpful rather than warning labels, but to achieve the same objective.
But we're talking about warning labels, we're talking about regulation, we're talking about shaming the companies. The only thing that's going to change is if their profit margin changes. If it's more profitable for them to have a dangerous product than to have a safe product, they're going to keep doing it. And they'll placate people, they'll put people on their boards, and they'll even do some things that might make things safe. But until you fundamentally change the economic paradigm, until you take the external costs of safety and internalize them in the cost of production, you're not going to have the safe product, and you're going to have companies continue to make the kind of cost-benefit analysis that you described, Bruce, because the consequences weren't there if they didn't adequately monitor.
Yeah, also I think to respond to Bruce, to me, in my mind, this is not an either-or question, it's a yes-and question, right? And so I 100% agree, like we need to see data, we need to make evidence-based decisions, and to get those data of the social media companies, then that would allow us to test, does a warning label work? Because that, at the end of the day, is how science works, right?
Do you think, though, that the addiction is always going to be bigger than the warning label? Because essentially, with cigarette packets, for example, as we were discussing, horrendous imagery to, get people off the addiction.
One of the things in the history of the tobacco was that Brown and Williamson had a product called Product 16, because they knew that a lifetime smoker was someone who started in their late teens or early teens. And that's the same thing that these social media companies doing. They're targeting their advertisement on kids, not just 13-year-olds, but 9 and 10-year-olds. I represent a family of a child who started at 9 years old, and 2 years later, she took her life.
It's horrendous. Tell us about some more cases that you've been working on.
Well, this is. I mean, these are real cases. These are real people. You sit in someone's living room and you talk to them. You think about as parents, there's nothing we wouldn't do to protect our children. The most innate instinct we have is to protect our children. Any of us in this room would jump in front of a speeding train to save our children, and yet we can't protect our children in their own homes, and we have to do something about that. So I represent a number of families whose children have taken their lives. A girl who hanged herself on TikTok, on live TikTok, and TikTok wouldn't take it down. A child that shot himself playing Russian roulette on TikTok. Or Selena Rodriguez, may her soul rest in peace. She was 11 years old. She had some problems, but she was holding it together. She became so addicted to social media that she became physically violent if you tried to take her phone away from her. And she was bullied, she was sexualized at a very, very early age. And on Snapchat, she took an overdose of Wellbutrin and she passed away. These are real people. And I was so sad to hear when talking to my colleagues in other parts of the world, this isn't just a US phenomenon. We've had a 146% increase in suicide among 12 to 16-year-olds. But I've heard around the world, our children are dying and we have to do something about it. Parents need to say enough is enough and hold these companies responsible and hit them where they live, hit them where their pocketbook. That's the only way we'll get the change we need.
What are the biggest obstacles, though, when trying to get court recoveries from these big social media giants? Well, what are the obstacles towards that?
Well, you got to have a thick skin. They have all the money in the world. They've got some very strong legal defenses. Inevitably, they're going to blame the parents. They're going to say they're bad parents. They're going to say they're bad kids, bad lawyers. But I feel like you have to stand up for what's right. My hero is Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer who led to the overturning of Brown versus Board versus Education. It took him 20 years and he lost along the way, but he knew it was right and he continued to fight. He took his lumps and he got up and he kept fighting. I, in 30 years of law practice, have never been more inspired about the work that I'm doing. I've never represented people more worthy of representation. None of these parents care about money. They just say, I don't want any other family to have to go through what we went through.
So, Johannes and Bruce, how do we create a safe online space for, constructive online debate rather than, it becoming nasty and abusive? How do we find that sort of medium?
In my mind, I think one of the aspects that I see as, I do research on social media, on digital technology, smartphones to use for good, to use as therapeutic tools, to use for robust peer support, and that also exists, right? So I think it's important to look at both sides of that equation. One thing I see working really well is the platform Reddit, for example, has community moderation, where people up and downvote contributions based on how much they contribute to the community. And that is a stark difference from algorithms that on Facebook, for example, has found that it sustains user attention more if there is conflict. And so posts that are creating conflict are always going to rise to the top. And community moderation does the opposite, where people essentially prioritize positive contributions to the community. So I think that could be a very tangible next step.
And Johannes, well, those remedies that you talk about are simple remedies. We talked about automobiles last night, and it takes a long time. If you start putting airbags in cars, it'll take 15 years before you have a safe, the whole fleet is safe. But in 15 days, you could make so many significant changes to these algorithms that you could make the products 75% safer in 15 days. The only thing is they'd have to take a little less money to do it. But I would say that the lives of our children are more important than the profits of these companies.
Just to add to something that Johannes said, there's a decision that's made. Anyone who uses TikTok and uses Twitter will most definitely in Europe or in the US will witness that it's very easy to get a day or a week's ban on TikTok because the terms of service are set in a quite prohibitive way. No hate speech, no abuse, no sexualization is permitted. Twitter has the opposite. Twitter, to breach the rules on Twitter, you really need to do something quite egregious. But that demonstrates to some extent that where the companies set the line actually matters. Then it just becomes a question that I said before, then they need to demonstrate how many people they've got doing those things. Now, I know that if you have an agent, it's a fascinating experience to empathize with the person whose job it is to assess whether content is permissible or not. Because what you realize very quickly is that it's a game that, it's a high stakes game that quite often these individuals will be sitting at a dashboard, and whether they're Instagram posts or Facebook live videos or tweets, they'll be coming in and they require an immediate review that probably the person is instructed to review 50 or 60 pieces of content a minute or maybe 500 every 10 minutes. And so immediately, it's like a video game where you're just looking for something that is wrong and you're trying to adjudicate on it. If you add the complexity that quite often these interventions are done in outsourced different countries, so quite often the person doing the review doesn't necessarily natively speak the same language as the person who posted it. So quite often abuse comes in colloquial language, it comes in slang, it comes in swear words. The challenge then for the agent, and a lot of these agents end up with post-traumatic stress disorder, the challenge for these agents is impossible. And then the question becomes, what's the incentive for the agent? Now, if the incentive for the agent is if you just approve everything and it stays up, your work isn't going to be reviewed by your boss. What you find is that the agents tend to let everything pass. If it's the opposite, TikTok seems to me to be the opposite, that probably they go on the side of a ban first and then you're allowed to appeal it, then the incentive works in the favor of that. So I think, just understanding how that whole ecosystem works is really critical, because the job for these agents, who are very often in the firing line, they're in a really difficult job, they have to go and review video of mass killings, they need to go and review sort of edits of mass killings. It's a really unpleasant job, but just understanding the mechanics of the incentives for them is a really critical part of this whole ecosystem.
Even if there's dangerous stuff on the internet, even if there's vulgar and horrible stuff on the internet, you don't need to have algorithms that send kids to it. You know, I mean, if the way the system is now built, the design is to maximize kids' time online and to continue to give them more and more outrageous stuff that stimulates their dopamine response. If you turn that off, if the internet, if social media were simply available for kids to look at, inevitably some kids are going to go in the wrong direction, but they're not going to be led there. They're not going to be directed there, and they're not going to be having sleep deprivation to go there. So I think that, you know, but that, you know, you're never going to have a perfectly safe product. You're never going to have a perfectly safe car. But we don't drive cars the way we did in 1930. We don't have cars the way they were in 1980. You could make a much safer product if the companies bore the financial responsibility of doing so. And that's where the legal system in our country and in other countries, I believe, can have a very important role.
So what's the solution to the algorithm? We mentioned earlier a subscription model of some sort. What would you say to each of you? You know, what in your mind could be the solution?
So what was just going through my mind as Matt talked is changing indicators to health and happiness, right? So not extracting attention from users, but optimizing for user happiness. And I think the other aspect that you know, we alluded to before, Bruce mentioned that we need access to data. And I believe that, you know, companies have a tremendous amount of data that could also point to indicators of early problems developing for users. So like at what point is a cutoff where you can see on the back end, you know, through the API, the data coming in, that person is spending a tremendous amount of time on a platform. At some point that could trigger an alert to reach out and be proactive and be preventative and have early intervention to check up on people.
I mean, that's where, you know, among other things, you could have age verification and identity verification. So the 14-year-old girl or the 14-year-old person that's the 67-year-old man who's posing as a 14-year-old girl, grooming children to give inappropriate photos, would be called out. You would know about that. You could warn people. I mean, these pedophiles use similar MOs, modus operandi. You could, as a requirement of getting an account, educate children as to what to look out for. The other thing you could do is limit screen time. We know that sleep deprivation in and of itself is a sequela of suicide and depression. You could turn the thing off. Tell me why there's any good reason why any child needs more than 3 hours a day of social media. These are very simple things. This is off-the-shelf technology. And then, of course, you could change the algorithms so they're not designed to keep kids online ad infinitum. These are simple, easily accomplished solutions.
Separately, what Facebook did in the last 2 years gives you an interesting lesson. What Facebook have done over the last 2 years is integrate all of their products with the same back end, so that, you know, long term, WhatsApp will be Facebook Messenger and the Instagram posts go on Facebook. But what that opens up is a suggestion that the policing end, the administrative safety end, could be a common platform that isn't necessarily owned by a proprietary company. So imagine a situation where, rather than it being a competitive advantage that Facebook was safer than Twitter or Instagram was safer than Snapchat, if there was a series of third-party suppliers that could supply the same leading technology across all of these platforms. And I think inadvertently, in Facebook demonstrating the ease of integrating, I think it raises a question that, you know, maybe authorities, administrators could say, I don't understand why it should be a competitive advantage that one platform has got different rules, different ways of policing safe speech. There should be no reason why YouTube is safer than Instagram. They should all be as safe as each other. And it raises an interesting question about whether that part of the business could be deconstructed a little.
We've very much spoken about social media, but is this the internet as a whole as well? Can the same rules be applied, or is it, you know, why is social media the main sort of culprit?
It's where people spend the majority of their time, first and foremost. I think, you know, there's no doubt challenges. The thing we discussed before there about a single identity is actually incredibly difficult. There are places, let's imagine Russia right now. There's places where people might want to keep their identity on platforms secret. We might conceive of a situation where actually if you look at the UK, and I think these things are surmountable, but there's 10 million people in the UK of a population of 70 million people, probably an adult population of 55. There's 10 million people who don't have a personally identifiable piece of documentation. They don't own a driving license, they don't own a passport, so they could verify their identity online. And in fact, the UK a couple of years ago was going to introduce a personal identifier to look at adult content, and they rejected it because it was so overwhelmingly complex.
But their algorithms, I mean, their technology will show that the same person who's posing as a 14-year-old boy, luring girls to give inappropriate photographs, is buying Geritol and Depends. I mean, they can figure this out. Their technology can have what's called estimated age. That technology exists, and I've seen the documents.
There's a really interesting parallel. All of the tech companies use a reverse image of known child porn images. So they all share the same database that they've got them. They've got them in negative format of all of these, that anytime an image is uploaded, it's checked against that. It's not owned by a single company. It's a shared resource between Microsoft, between all the other companies. And so that gives you a parallel, that this doesn't need to be proprietary technology. Policing the safety of the web doesn't need to be a competitive edge.
And what you're telling is that the people, the entities most capable of implementing these safety mechanisms are the manufacturers, are the products. And the idea of product liability is that it's their responsibility not just to follow regulations, but to think proactively, to think creatively. And if they're on the hook and strict liability, they will. Not because they're great people, but because it's in their economic interest.
I also want to bring it back to a little bit more of a positive note, because I think, when you compare technology to a cigarette, for example, nothing is ever going to make a cigarette safe, right? A cigarette's always going to be harmful once you use it. Technology doesn't have to be. Technology can be a tremendous opportunity to provide robust peer support. We can support each other on social media. A smartphone can be the therapist in your pocket that can provide you with real-time help at the time when you need it, at the place when you need it, as you go about your daily life. And it doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be. It is in our control to change the situation. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity here if we are willing to go there, if we're willing to take it.
Bruce, how do you think we can use technology for good then?
It's really interesting, changing the incentives. One of the challenges we had at Twitter was that the average person who uses Twitter uses it for about 7 minutes a day. It's a really low usage. One of the things when we hear about some other social platforms is if they were capped, if Instagram usage or TikTok usage was capped at an hour's use, then the incentive of trying to keep people to stay longer would be different. Now the incentive would be to leave people with a positive experience where they were excited to come back the next day. So it's just interesting to think about these things, sometimes with a bit more nuance, a bit more difference to them. The interesting challenge about all of this, we were chatting before, and the interesting challenge about all of this is that sometimes we conceive that, and I know that we can end up when we watch programs like The Social Dilemma, we conceive that there's a master plan and there's a sinister master plan, whereas the origin story certainly of Twitter and Instagram are largely similar, they were creations of people who just wanted to share content and trying to explore the new devices. Twitter was created when people could text. It was an SMS platform. They could text what they were doing. Instagram was, with the advent of camera phones, let's use the image that was available. And now we look at it and we say, the evidence about social media damaging health is so complex and so opaque, it's not always clear. But the one thing we might say is that the evidence that seems strongest is that Instagram really harms young girls, seems to be the strongest evidence. Now, I guarantee that no one, when Instagram was being conceived, even remotely considered that that was going to be a consequence of it. So sometimes we can construe the creation of these platforms with a malign intent. I think there's got to be a recognition then that any degree of regulation, any degree of control needs to be as flexible as the usage of the platforms has been. But it needs to change over time.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it was a sorcerer's apprentice, but at some point they realized what their technology was doing and they made a moral choice. They could have gone one way and they could have gone the other way. And I think that what I'd like to share is that the legal system in the United States is not unique in providing and guaranteeing financial compensation. You know, 500 years before Blackstone's commentaries, Sharia law had developed a very sophisticated jurisprudence of compensating people financially when through the negligence someone is injured or died. I would encourage my brothers and sisters in the Arab world to think about whether there are mechanisms that the Sharia law can be used to provide justice on behalf of families whose children are injured. And similarly in South Korea, there's Section 762, which provides a vehicle for people to seek redress. I would encourage everyone to think about what they can do in the legal systems in their country to try to hold these companies accountable and to try to change the economic calculus so it's cheaper to make safe products than dangerous ones.
Thank you so much. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and in those couple of minutes, I'd very much like each of you to just tell our audience your key message, you know, why you're here today, and what your message is off the back of our conversation. Johannes, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so reiterating that it should be a yes and not a but. So a yes and to me means 3 levels. You tinker with your own behavior, make changes to your own technology use, and see how that feels. See how it improves your life, and keep going with it. Because it is not a one and done, it is an ongoing process. The second level is we can change social norms in our immediate environment, and that is scalable. That will scale. If we all do it, we can make a change. And the third point is holding companies accountable and changing algorithms to prioritize mental health and well-being. Thank you.
I start from the perspective, I'm a huge fan of social products. I adore YouTube, I adore TikTok. I still have a heavy user of Twitter. And I very strongly can see the benefit that these platforms create. The critical thing for me is that quite often if you work in these big companies, you serve a dual role. You're the spokesperson for the organization outside the organization, and inside your job is to fight for the user's benefit. And I think if I knew that some of that discourse was a bit more public, if I knew that there was a degree more transparency about what went on inside the organizations, it would have made those conversations more public. So, you know, that's why I really stand by that. First and foremost, companies should have to publish the amount of users who interact with them, the amount of users who reach out to them, what the reasons are for that. They should have to publish the amount of people dealing with that. Because I personally feel that once that information was out and publicly available, and and maybe it could include how long users were spending on the platforms, and they had to publish that information, it immediately changes the discourse. I think it holds them far more accountable. So I'm all about exposing the workings of these organizations to daylight, really.
Very wise words.
I just want to say that I came here lonely and afraid that I was all alone. And I've seen people from all over the world. And it's been sad because other countries and other people have seen the same grief and talked to parents who've lost their children. But I also see tremendous possibility because we're not alone. We can solve this if we stand together as parents from different countries, from different races, from different faiths. We are all parents, and we can do this if we stand together. And Dr. Al-Rashid, what you have done, this is the catalyst. I feel that we might have actually tipped the balance and developed a cohesion and a paradigm so that we as parents and we as citizens of the world can protect our children and our children's children.
Such a thought-provoking discussion. We could talk about this for hours. We really could. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for coming in and chatting with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for our panel there. Thank you.